welcome back. The hashtag Less is More campaign celebrates the first anniversary of the Less is More Act. After being signed into law by Governor Kathy Hochul, the act has made a transformative impact on tens of thousands of New Yorkers in the parole system. Joining us now is the Director of Community Organizing at the Katal Center for Equity, Health, and Justice, Kenyatta Muzzanni. And Kenyatta, thank you so much for being with us again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Super excited.
Yeah, so 1 year later, and we talk about 1 year later, less is more, and we've seen some progress, huh?
Yeah, we've seen a bit of progress. And I think it's helpful if I also just start out with what Less is More New York does before moving into progress, just to help
Absolutely.
people get acclimated. So hashtag Less is More New York, it's our campaign, and it is the most transformative parole bill across the country. What it does is there are four major provisions, and the first is that it restricts the use of incarceration for technical parole violations, which is really critical. The second is that it eliminates automatic detention based on a mere accusation of a technical violation. The third is that it bolsters due process. And the fourth is that it provides an earned time credit, also known as 30 for 30, which helps people who are doing well off parole get off parole earlier, which just keeps them in their community. And it has been a whirlwind of a year. The bill was signed into law last year on September 17th, 2021. And since then, we have just seen a dramatic change in the parole system across New York State. To date, with Less is More New York, we've actually reduced the entire community supervision population by more than 40% in New York.
Wow.
And so 40%, like, what does that mean in real numbers and in humans? It means that more than 13,000 people have been discharged from parole. That are, like you named, like tens of thousands of people. But if you look at like their families, their loved ones, entire community, that are millions of people across New York whose lives have been dramatically improved because of Less is More New York. And oddly enough, that's not the only thing that's happened. Because of the provisions of Less is More New York, we've actually also been able to reduce the number of people who are held in local jails by nearly 90% across New York. And more than 1,500 people have actually been released from jails and prisons across the state. So it has been a really wild ride of a year. And so many people have just been positively impacted by Less is More.
Yeah, and so when we talk about 13,000 people, that's no number to snuff at. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. But since we're talking about where things were before, talk about the difference between before and now, because obviously a lot of families, a lot of individuals have actually been impacted. But this has definitely been, in many ways, a weight and a burden that's been lifted off of so many people.
Yes, it really has. New York pretty much led the entire country for incarcerating people for technical violations. And in 2019, roughly a third of all people who were admitted to state jails were there just for technical violations of parole. And that just really shows you how embedded incarceration due to parole violations were really taking front and center, unfortunately, in New York. And so the situation was just incredibly dire, where there were just thousands of people who were on parole. And now we've seen this 40% reduction where 13,000 people have been discharged. And this, again, is only in the first year. The impacts of Less is More New York will continue to be felt for a very long time. And it has just radically changed the entire parole system to what it was pre-pandemic, and even right up until the bill was signed.
Right. And so even though we've seen this in terms of parole, I know that there were still some things people are trying to see with regards to with parole reform. This is huge. But if I talk to some people, they say there's still more that needs to be done. Do you agree?
Absolutely. This is Less is More New York is a step in the right direction, and it is the absolute necessary step to just keep up with New York being a leader when it comes to criminal justice reform. But there were other provisions and parole reform bills that were left on the table last session, and those included elder parole, fair and timely parole. And so there is still a lot of more work that does need to be done for the entire parole system. And Less is More New York is still one step in the right direction to make sure that we have some semblance of justice for people who have been impacted by this and the larger community. I think the thing for me that's also really that has stood out since we've done the Less is More New York campaign is how impactful it is, not only on the people who have been on parole, but also their loved ones and people in their community who care. And so in the same way that Less is More New York has had, this major impact, we want to keep and continue that trend and make sure that the other parole bills are not just left on the table, and that we're steering New York in this direction towards actual and legitimate criminal justice reform.
Yeah. And so for yourself, I mean, the work continues, and give us a little bit about what you've been doing these days.
We're working on implementation. That is what the Less is More New York Coalition has done. And ever since September 17th, we signed it into law, and it got signed into law, and it was an amazing moment. And we all took time to pause and celebrate and just recharge. But now the nitty-gritty work of implementation is upon us. And so where we stand now, it's been a full year since the bill has been signed into law. The entire time since then, we've been working on make sure that the bill is implemented as the law states, make sure people know their rights. And so even though we are now at a place where all of the provisions of the bill have been fully implemented, we're continuing to work with our defenders across the state who have been working with their clients who have been impacted by parole. We're continuing to work with our members who have been impacted by parole to make sure that they know what their laws are, they know what the new law is, make sure their communities know what the law is, and we're continuing to protect the bill. I think we've seen the impact of criminal justice reform at large in New York State. And so we're continuing to shore up our work to make sure that Less is More New York is protected and that it's implemented correctly.
So when the bill was signed into law, some people always ask the question about how long does it take before we see immediate implementation, things happening right away. How long was it before you actually able to see the law actually take effect from the time that the governor signed it in?
Well, one of the unique things that happened when Less is More New York was signed into law is that Governor Kathy Hochul immediately discharged over 100 people on Rikers Island who were held for technical parole violations. And so that was an amazing thing that was done, was it was exactly within the limits of the law for her to do. And we saw that immediate change of people going back into their communities. Subsequent to that, though, most of the provisions of the law went into effect in March of 2022. So we had that period of time in between September of 2021 and then March of 2022. And then we had to wait until, and then most of the provisions went into effect until September 1st. So we were able to see some immediate changes with the bill and immediate, I should say, impact with Less is More, but there was still some time that we did have to wait. And we continued to do everything we could to make this as smooth of a process for everyone as we could.
Yeah. For someone who's on parole, I think that many times we just hear the word parole, but people don't always understand what's associated with that. For instance, curfew. People know about that. But what are some of the challenges that a person incurs while being on parole? Because while this bill has taken effect and helped those who are on it, so many people are not aware of what happens when a person is on parole.
Correct. So I can share a little bit about what happens with a person now that Less is More New York is law if they're on parole versus what would have happened to them prior to the bill. So prior to the law being implemented. So now let's say you're on parole and you are still technically under the custody of the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. You mentioned curfew. I won't use that example, but let's say you have to check in for your parole. And so you got off of work, you're trying to get on the C train, you're trying to go uptown, and the train is late. How often have all of us been on the train and it's just been delayed in the station? If you were on parole and you were late for your meeting with your parole officer prior to Less is More New York, that would constitute a technical violation that you could have been incarcerated for. So people who are on parole often have to face harsher stipulations than people who are not on parole. And if I was a few minutes late to a doctor's appointment or a few minutes late to a meeting with my supervisor, okay, I wouldn't have to be fearful of showing up to that appointment and knowing that I may be 30 minutes late or even more because of the train and fearing for incarceration. And so most people don't recognize that people who are on parole have so many stipulations. Thankfully, because of Less is More New York, situations like that won't necessarily happen anymore. But there are other things and stipulations that people on parole have to do, and it's individualized. Usually your parole officer hands you a set of stipulations. There may be some common ones, but usually that is a conversation between the person on parole and their parole officer. But they are often on stipulations that are just a lot harsher than if they were not on parole.
Can you give me a little idea as to where we stand as far as New York State's parole system compared to other states around the country?
Correct. So prior to Less is More New York, like I said, we were terrible when it comes to incarcerating people. And our partners over at the Commission and the Justice Lab put out a report in 2021 on the cost of incarceration, the enormous cost. And New York came at the #1 worst place for incarcerating people for technical violations. And even prior to less is more, a few years earlier, the Bureau of Justice Statistics put out a report that ranked New York as being #1 for demanding that people on parole go into incarceration for drug treatment. And we have been just the worst in the country with parole reform. So I would say stay tuned in the next few weeks for just hearing updates on the Less is More New York coalition and campaign around where we now stand now that we have been a year out with Less is More. And folks can always check that out on our campaign website, which is lessismoreny.org. And I also wanted to point out that on our website, instead of hearing from me, you can directly hear from people who have been on parole or who have loved ones who are on parole about their experiences and their stories about Less is More New York. So if you go on our campaign website, lessismoreny/stories, you can click on that stories tab and just read a few read from people who have been on parole or their loved ones are on parole about the impact that this law has had on them.
Yeah, I was going to drill down a little bit more on that one, because when we talk about the individual, that's one thing, but then uh, share with us a little bit about that family component, because when a person is incarcerated, we've often said the family's in incarceration. When a person's on parole, the same thing happens. It seems as though families are also on parole because they share in that person's struggle.
Absolutely. Throughout the entire Less is More New York campaign, we heard from people who were on parole and their loved ones, their immediate family or family members who were taking care of them, horror stories about the fear that they had just for technical parole violations. Stories of people who their partner was having a medical procedure and they had to choose between going out and potentially missing their curfew or having to miss a very important life moment with their family member, whether that was a procedure or whether that was even a family member having a baby or having something else happen to them. We heard of grandparents who are stuck in this cycle of raising their grandkids because their children are either on parole and maybe incarcerated, or their children, meaning the parents of the grandchildren, may have certain stipulations where they can't always visit their family members or spend that time because of how harsh their parole sentences are. Now with Less is More, we have heard from our members and their family members about how the situation is totally different. They're able to travel to see their families a little more because they don't necessarily have the fear of incarceration. They're able to not get concerned if they're a few minutes late because they were at their kids' event at school or a summer event and the train is running a few minutes late. They don't have that fear anymore. And I think when you pointed out and said that when someone is on parole, really the entire family is on parole, that's the insidious nature of the criminal legal system, the criminal justice system that we all have to operate in. It's never just an individual is on community supervision or an individual has been impacted by the criminal justice system. It has an impact on the entire family, and that in turn has an impact on the entire community. And what we have seen throughout the Less is More New York campaign is that communities have shown up. Communities know the impact that this is going to have. And so we have everyone on this campaign, from grandparents to parents to children to young people, who know the impact that incarceration and community supervision have, not just only on their immediate family, but in the families of their friends and loved ones as well.
Kenyatta, can you tell me when it comes to those persons that have been, released from parole and the fact of this parole reform, the work doesn't stop there, because even though you're off parole, there's still another layer of transition that has to occur. What kind of resources are available for those persons after their parole has been their time with parole has been up?
That's a really good question. So one of the critical things for us in working on the Less is More New York campaign is that we worked with an entire coalition that included some of the family members that I named earlier, and it also included direct service providers. And those direct service providers spanned housing, employment opportunities, educational opportunities, so many different direct service providers. public defenders we even mentioned. So we've been working with those direct service providers and with those other groups to make sure that they were embedded in the coalition, and to make sure that we could always reach out to them and say, hey, now that Less is More New York is signed into law and it's implemented, what resources do you have? What extra support do you have to support people who may be discharged, former clients that may have been on your caseload who will not be on your caseload? Start that process of the transition to help them back into their community. And so we've continued to make sure that we meet with different service providers, bring them into the fold with what Less is More New York is doing, especially now that it is law, and to make sure that we provide supports for people. And I think it's also a time for us to continue investing in new supports as a state, because we have a lot of resources. And especially in a city like New York, there are so many resources, but there's so many needs that people have. And so
Right.
if we could just continue to invest in our communities even further to provide different types of supports for people, additional supports for people, making those connections for people who may be on a caseload and feel like, I'm just on this caseload, but what is it really doing? Make those deeper connections and investments to get more resources that we need. We are saving the state on average $680 million every year for no longer arresting and incarcerating people for technical parole violations. And that is a huge amount of money. So just want to name that. We can continue to do more.
Yeah. So for people who want to be able to partner with you in the work that you're doing, somebody who wants to, lend their voice, or maybe they have a family member that is on parole or getting off of parole, how do they get in contact, and what do they need to do?
Absolutely. So definitely go onto our campaign website, lessismoreny.org. From there, you'll be able to see different ways that you can get involved and take action. You can, like I was sharing earlier, if you have a story of how Less is More New York has impacted you, you can definitely share that. And I know that this is specific to the Bronx, but our organization and our allies are all throughout New York. So if you happen to come across this video and you live, let's say, in Binghamton, and you're like, man, I want to get involved in this. I know someone on parole. I'm on parole. We definitely have ways that everybody can take part in this. So go to lessismoreny.org and you'll be able to take action with us.
All right. Kenyatta Muzzanni, we got to leave it there, but thank you so much for this information. Great to hear the work and the progress that's been made over the course of the past year. And as you said, still much work needs to be done. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.
All righty. We're going to take a quick break here on the Social Justice Forums, and we'll be back in a moment.